Hey everyone, it's GM Josh Friedel here. I wanted to talk to you guys today about repelling a knight takes g5 sacrifice. Either it could be Gyoko Piano or Lopez. Today we're going to look at it from an Archangel Roy Lopez or Spanish. This actually occurred in a recent game from Biel, is it? Oh my goodness. I'm very bad with whatever names of the tournaments are going on. I just know what's going on. It was a game between Abhimanyu Mishra and Praggnanandhaa, so two extremely strong junior players. And it was really, really interesting because it kind of exhibited, I thought, a lot of different ways to look at this sacrifice, and I thought it would be at least very interesting and hopefully useful as far as how to think about these kind of things. So I just wanted to show how it came about. So this is a Lopez. You can also get this kind of sacrifice in, closed Gyoko piano positions, for example. You get something like this, say, this is just one example, obviously, of how to play, but, and you get positions where white plays like a bishop out to g5 early, for example. Again, many move orders here. I'm not getting into the details of all of them, but basically, you can get a similar kind of thing here. But we end up getting it from an Archangel Roy Lopez. I used to play this as black quite a bit, so I have some experience both dealing with this sack, both repelling it and losing brutally to it. So it's a very scary thing to face. So let me show you how it happens. So here white plays c3. The main move kind of is a4, and in most kinds of lines, a4 is a more accurate move order if you're planning to play it, because it doesn't allow options like this, and if an option like bishop b7, you have d3. So c3, of course, is totally fine, but if you were to play an a4 line now, you give different options for black, which are not terrible. So again, it's not a big deal. So here, Praggnanandhaa plays h3, which has a sort of specific purpose. So this is one thing I wanted to show. So the main thing is this pin with bishop g5. So as we all know, pins are annoying. Pins are irritating. This knight being pinned makes our life kind of bad. It's just an annoying thing to always deal with. So the normal way we repel such a pin would be something like h6 and g5. So there are, in some kind of more closed variations, let's say there's a pawn back here, we have other ways to deal with this kind of thing. One way, for example, would be queen e7, bishop e6, trade off the bishop and put our queen on e6. It's very slow, but it also can get the job done. In general, though, I would say that that's very, very slow. It's not realistic in positions with the pawn on d4, so almost always we're going to go for a g5 move. So one advantage here is that we can play g5 now fairly safely, and the reason why is because this kind of sacrifice is just not scary anymore, because king's not castled. So we can play a move like rook g8, for example, hit this bishop, and this is already like just not very sound. First of all, white's a bit underdeveloped here, which also helps us. But for example, if they play a move like h4, trying to maintain this pin, we can even just sacrifice and bishop g4 I quite like. So the idea is that if the queen moves, for example, we play our knight out here. This pin and taking here is going to be nasty. The queen comes out. This is a huge disaster for white. Really not good. And if they try to play a move like f3, we take, and then we're going to take like the house, right? Check, take here. This is hanging. This is just, again, just huge, huge trouble. We're going to not only take a rook, we're going to make a queen. So it's going to be way too much material, suffice it to say. White's king's also terrible, so this is quite clearly not good. But the whole point is that if they do it before you castle, it's very rare that it's scary, because you have moves like rook g8. Keep in mind, white's own king is not so great. If you try to play back, for example, I can play a move like this, and already you're tempted to just break the pin yourself, which isn't really what you want to do. So this kind of thing is not scary. That's an important thing to note. So that's partially why Praggnanandhaa plays move h3. It's a bit of a waiting move. It does keep bishop g4 moves at bay, which I think is important. And black's not obligated to castle here. Black could play a move like bishop b7. But the general problem you face is if you try to play like cutesy, where you play a move like h6 to stop it, white plays bishop e3, castles knight bd2. This is relatively normal, but there's a bit of awkwardness with your pieces. You always have to watch out. Oops, sorry. You always have to watch out for these kind of moves every move. It's actually not so easy to improve your pieces. White has very, very good central control. So positions like this are actually quite tricky. So there's a reason why you would decide not to play h6. If you play castles, the advantage you have now is if white tries to play like that, here you're basically saving a move on h6, and it's very useful. So here, Praggnanandhaa does play rook e1 to support the pawn on e4. Black plays rook e8. So now the whole point of this exercise is that at some point you're threatening to take. You have to be very careful when this knight is loose. If you try to take that pawn in a lot of ways. So for example, if white plays here and you decide to take, you have to deal with moves like this. So you have to be somewhat careful, but you often will have different ways to take. For example, after pawn takes pawn, you're already threatening rook takes pawn. So that's sort of the point. So here Praggnanandhaa does play bishop g5. And this is where you have to make decisions. So black plays h6. This is usually a very easy move to play. White never wants to take, and throwing in h6, bishop h4 is rarely incorrect. But now the choices are a bit difficult. So I'm kind of curious, would you guys play g5 here? It's just a bit of a question. So again, this is the kind of thing where you really have to calculate. So basically, up until this point, you don't have to make like super tough choices. Obviously, allowing the pin is annoying. You want to be careful. But when you play g5, it is a huge, huge decision. So here, my instinct was that this was way too early. So first of all, there are times white could even take with the bishop because your f7 pawn is weak. But knight takes looked very natural to me. And here it turns out black's okay, but you have to be kind of a maniac. So the normal idea here to defend would be king g7. The purpose of king g7, it looks a bit mysterious, but it defends the knight, frees the rook. Because one of the funny things is that you kind of want to uncastle once you've done this, right? You want to bring your rook out and bring your king back, or bring your rook here and bring your king back is a very common idea. It also frees up your queen. There are times you even play queen d7 or some move like that to unpin your knight, because your knight is defended. Although it's a very flimsy defense, you have to be very careful. But the problem here is white has this rook lift immediately, and this looks super scary. So for example, yeah, I mean, like the rook's going to come to e3 or f3, and you're already actually in trouble. If you try this and I play rook here, you're already losing your knight. So this would be an example of things going astray very quickly. The only way you can actually play is with this, the idea being you take away the e3 square. And white plays bishop d5. This is something I also wanted to note, because this is one of the earmarks of whether g5 will work. So number one, it's development, right? If white's super developed and you're not, probably g5 you're going to get slaughtered. If you have a huge lead in development, I've had a case where I had a big lead in development. My opponent sacked. It was still looked dangerous, but my lead in development gave me time to repel the sacrifice pretty well. The other thing is loose pieces. So this is actually a funny thing. Normally, in Archangel type positions, if I go back a bit, having a4, rook b8 thrown in is kind of nice for white, right? They force your rook off the open file, things like this. If white's going for dynamic play with this sacrifice on g5, having this loose knight and loose rook is actually really comes in handy for white. So if you're planning to play this way as white, you actually want to leave this stuff alone, generally speaking, because, and oops, sorry, this line perfectly illustrates this, that in this position, bishop d5 is a super annoying move simply because your knight and rook are not able to move. So bishop d7 is necessary. Going this way, you're too tied up, and the bishop doesn't contribute to your defense. So this is actually asking for more trouble. So you have to play like this, and then here you have to play the move rook b8 to take a whole move to unpin. To me, this is very unnatural. Like, I would just not do this. Computer will tell you it's playable, but it's the kind of thing that I think a human being would not do. If you were to ask Mishra, would you do this? He'd be like, nah, you know. I just don't think that this is necessary. Keep in mind as well that white doesn't have an immediate threat. The nice thing with the pin is that it's annoying. That's not a nice thing, I suppose. But it also is not terminal, right? Like they're not going to crush you with this pin just yet. So you can take your time. The one thing I would say is that when you run out of useful things to do, you really want to be able to break that pin or play g5. You can't sit forever. White will be able to improve their knight and improve their pieces. It's not going to be fun. But here Mishra chooses bishop b7, which I think is logical. Praggnanandhaa plays queen d3, so the idea is that he wants to be able to play knight d2 and not have the pawn hang. Were he to play here, I think black could safely take this, and this is not great. And here, Mishra again decides to delay the g5 move with knight a5. So you could play g5 here, but once again, it looks so dangerous. Knight takes g5 alone is very scary. So here, for example, if you try to take, you get blasted by this. This is something which you do not want to miss. A move like e5. Because here, I mean, if knight takes, you simply sack. Queen check. You can't go here because of mates. Oops, sorry. So here, bishop takes f6 check, and you lose your queen, and everything falls. So that's very scary. Oops, sorry. So here you cannot take the pawn. I think king g3 is a reasonable try. But now you have to deal with all sorts of things. Queen g3 was the move that worried me most. So a move like queen g3 is funny because it doesn't necessarily threaten a huge check, but it's definitely an annoying move. So for example, a move like knight h5 is a common antidote. But the problem here is I can play queen g4, and then this knight kind of has to go back. Like, it's not very useful, and white can do all sorts of things. So a move like knight h5 is not super useful. Rook g8 would be a typical way to deal with this, and I think this move makes a lot of sense. And here, it's just very scary. White can play a move like rook e3, for instance. You have to play here, rook f3. And here, believe it or not, you have to just ignore everything and play knight a5. And this is kind of what I mean, right? Because this knight can't move due to the f7 pawn being attacked. Notice how this bishop is still putting pressure. So to me, this is like way too risky. Apparently, it's playable. This is one of those things where I would encourage you, if you are trying to learn these positions for black or for white, don't, like, the computer is nice. It'll tell you whether it's okay or not. But realize there are lots of positions where a computer may evaluate it as fine for black, but almost any human being would lose it horribly because it's just too difficult to play. You have to find only moves like that. I would define that position after g5 as that way. I should also mention that taking with the bishop is also very frightening because this pawn on f7 is horrible. You can't really have time to play a move like rook f8 or rook e7. The queen's going to come over. You're going to get slaughtered. So the only move here, is knight h5, allowing this capture with check. The idea being that this knight is now hanging and you have knight f4. So white could take with the knight, and now you have to play queen f6, allowing infinite discoveries, including knight takes e5 check. The only way you can play. So if you think you can find these moves over the board, more power to you. But in general, I would say that this is just a very poor way to play. So when you're trying to prepare these sort of lines, or when you're trying to figure it out, you want to kind of be able to see how many dangers there are to you. And here, it's very clear that after queen d3, if you play g5 now, white has way too many dangerous ideas. So you have to calculate this stuff, but you also have to use your judgment, meaning that, okay, is this, like, and it's not like white's taking that big of a risk. Like, these sacrifices, you're getting 2 pawns for the piece already. You are very likely getting a third and an attack. It's not like white's like risking their whole position, right? But to do this sacrifice. So it's one of those things you want to time really well, keeping in mind that if you don't play g5, you will not lose immediately. The danger of not playing g5 is that if you have to start making moves that are not that useful, your position is just going to get worse and worse. So you want to time g5 when you kind of run out of useful stuff and when you have managed it so it's more safe. So Mishra chooses knight a5. And I can tell by the times that he's not that familiar with this position. He thought a long time on knight a5. So this was kind of a judgment call by him, and I think a very good one. So of course Praggnanandhaa does not want to give up this bishop. And here Mishra decides to pull the trigger with g5 after it's like a 7-minute thing. So the problem he had here is that if you don't play g5, you're starting to run out of useful moves. Moves like knight c4, you can simply play b3. It's not very useful. The only other useful move I can find is something like c5, which actually I think is fairly logical. The problem is if white plays with d5, your pieces now are really don't make sense, so you probably should move your bishop back to try to put it on d7. And this position's kind of playable. You do something like this, maybe you play bishop d7, eventually like king h8 and try to play g5, try to prepare g5 that way. You have kind of a locked, interesting position. I don't think it's that bad, but it's also a bit uncomfortable. Like, white does have a lot of time to try to build up an attack. It's very difficult for you to play and do a lot of stuff on the queen side. I do believe that white, is a bit happier. But this would be a playable option. I would strongly consider this if I felt like I was outbooked, which clearly he was. Praggnanandhaa was playing fairly quickly. So I would consider not playing g5 here if I'm facing a well-prepared opponent. That is a personal preference. One thing I've noticed is that very rightly, a lot of these young, strong players have so much faith in their calculation, they're willing to take these risks. I have to say, when I was younger, I would probably play g5 too. I think c5 is like an older person's move, sort of. But that being said, I mean, there are plenty of options, of course. And I don't think g5 is a poor move. I think computer preferred it to c5 by a bit, although it was fairly close. Again, I'm not looking at these things with computer that long, so that could be a bit wrong. But I would say that, I just like to kind of see, like, what... Like, I was amazed the computer thought those, like, g5 was playable on those two previous moves. I was amazed. Again, maybe if I let it think longer, it's going to be like, nah, bro. But I don't know. So, g5... So, yeah, the sacrifice, he had to kind of know what's coming. You can play a move like bishop g3. And I wanted to discuss this, actually, so I'm going to take a huge detour, which I apologize for. But in this position, for example, after bishop g5, the sacrifice we discussed not working, but what happens after bishop g3? So the general gist is that once the bishop lands on g3, even if we're castled, let's say we castle here, this pawn's always hanging, so they're not going to just win the e5 pawn. Let's say they go here and we pin their knight. One thing I would say is that your king is still not safe, but because there's no longer a sacrifice, you can play a bit more freely and more aggressively. The very important thing about positions like this is to play aggressively. You do not want to play like this. I made this mistake, I remember, against a GM called Udasin when I was less experienced, and he horribly punished me. My king just got weaker and weaker because I played a bit too passively. And one thing that was explained to me is that you have to play these positions fairly aggressively, because if you have to keep white sort of defending against your threats. So whether that's with knight h5, sometimes your bishop can draw back to g6 if they kick it. Other times you just want to just try to shred their center. And one thing to remember is that if things simplify, it tends to be nice for you in some ways, because this bishop on g3 is bad. If they ever play d5, you're very happy. The bishop on g3 is not great. Your king is good. So it's a position where I think that both sides, there's a lot of back and forth. You have to be very cautious if you ever grab this d4 pawn, because you are opening up the position with your king being a bit loose. So I would say that these positions are actually quite double-edged and interesting, positions like this, but it should be mentioned, right? So the same thing kind of applies to this position, right? If white plays bishop back to g3 and you get in knight h5 and stuff like that, you don't have bishop g4, but your queen can maybe come out to f6, for example. I didn't check this, but this looks very logical with ideas of knight f4. And I don't know. It looks like you're relatively happy here. Of course, there's more to it. And also, I'm realizing that this might be a position you could think about grabbing a pawn. This would obviously have to be checked. You have other options here, but I would say that even if you can't grab that pawn, if you can play knight h5, queen f6, like you're relatively happy. You have white at bay. You have active pieces. What more can you want out of life, right? So the sacrifice was definitely what he calculated and what he was worried about. Praggnanandhaa thinks 2 minutes before sacrificing, even though I think he's out of his theory at this point. So that kind of gives you some idea. So it takes, and this is where we start to reach difficult decisions. At the moment, king g7 is kind of the main useful move that you almost always play. You really need to defend that knight, and it gives your rook room. So here, if white tries to be, do brute force right away, the problem is you have too many defensive resources. You can play rook g8 and try to move your king. You can play knight h5 here, I believe works. If queen g4, you can even go back. kind of obnoxious. But I think rook g8 is the simpler way to do it and bring the king back. And I think white just doesn't have enough firepower here to harm you too much. Notice if they try to go here to try to aim for this, you can always play rook h8 if you need to. They just don't have the firepower to beat you just yet. So what Praggnanandhaa does is he plays the move knight d2, which is very logical, but also kind of scary because when you, basically white's saying, I got time. Your king's not going anywhere, I got time. And it is nice to have a move. The question is, how do you use the move? And this is, again, where you can pause and try to figure this out. This is very difficult. So this is actually where Mishra made a slight mistake. So you can bring your rook out. You can try to unpin with your queen. You have lots of different moves. The question is, which one is accurate? And it's all about details. You can have general ideas of how positions like this are played, but without the details, it just doesn't work. Like, you need details to make it work, So which one would you do? So the normal way, which I would kind of my default move, so to speak, just having defended these positions, would be rook h8. The idea is that your king is ready to run. It gives the knight the h5 square for support. So for example, if queen g3, you can play knight h5, and this is a very nice defense. You have to be careful, these kind of check moves, but here they don't do anything. You can capture the bishop with the king safely. There are positions you cannot do that. For example, sometimes there's a position with a pawn here and bishop here, and if they play bishop f6 check, you actually have to sidestep with king h7. I've had a game like this. It looks ridiculous. The reason being because if you take it, there's queen g5 mate. Anyway, a bit astray, but I had a game where that was a pattern. So here it's kind of annoying because like they play queen h4, you play f6, they're sort of running out of firepower, right? So this doesn't really work here. The move queen f3 doesn't really threaten that much. This knight's defended, so you can probably take this pawn, I think. It still gets kind of scary because there's moves like queen f5 coming in, and I don't know. There's also e5, but I think you can safely grab the queen. And this endgame I thought should be more or less fine. It's even material, and your pieces are pretty active, so... bishop on b6 is fine. You have to be careful with the king, but I think it's not so easy to advance white's pawns, which makes it easier for yourself, so it should be okay. So yeah, I wasn't too worried about that, but rook e3 would definitely scare me, and this is an idea. So this is kind of a funny thing. So normally when I've dealt with these positions, my experience is the rook on f1 is better for white because they can play with f4, and that gets really scary for your knight, which is true. Sometimes you can get out of it, but really that's really frightening when they're just ready with that rook. However, one thing with the rook on e1 is they can lift it, and then they not only have this, they have this, and that gets really, really scary. So here I think queen d7 is the move I looked at. And it's actually very, very important. So you have this, and then you have knight h5 attacking the rook. And bishop e7 check. Yeah, and then I think you have to ignore the bishop and play here. Yeah. And this is actually like really weird. So how does this go again? So here... yeah, no. Here you lose because queen f3 hits both. Yeah, this is the whole idea. You lose because queen f3 hits both the h5 knight and the pawn. If you take the rook, I take here, and you're gonna be toast. Yeah. So because your queens lose, I have bishop g5 check and just taking your queen and things like this. So yeah, this is not good. So the reason why you actually have to play this move, and the idea is that now I have rook g3 here, check. King h7, queen f3 no longer is a double attack because you defend this. And then if queen f3, we can take the rook, and white can actually go here, and the game continues, funnily enough. But you can play queen g8 and try to get your queen back. Notice how the knight on g3 defends against mate and check threats for the moment. One thing you have to get used to as black is you have to be very willing to give material back. It happens all the time. Obviously not too much, but giving material back is often a key defense. So this would have been really, really difficult, I think, with queen e8. So I understand Mishra's preference because he wants to break the pin right now, so he doesn't have to deal with this rook e3 to rook g3 thing. It makes total sense. It's playable rook h8, but rook e3 is very scary. So the question is, where do you move the queen? And he chose wrongly. So queen d7 is the best move, it turns out. I don't know if he was worried about like d takes e5, because the point is he can't take with the pawn now because check and his queen hangs. This is why maybe he went to c8, but I think you can take with the rook and it's more or less okay. In general, I don't think that would phase him. Like rook takes e5, it feels like you can hit this bishop or even sack for it is very playable. This doesn't feel too problematic. So maybe he missed something else, but the main idea with queen d7 is that if we go for this line and they take and we play here, our queen kind of defends our knight, which turns out to be very, very important. So it's still kind of an unclear position, but the whole point is if they go for this line, which in the other line is really deadly, we have the move rook g4, g8, check, and we block with the knight, and our queen defends. So this would actually be not good for white, I believe. There's some other line which ends in a draw. There's bishop e7 check here. There's all sorts of other stuff. But the point is that after queen c8, queen g3, knight h7, which was kind of a similar idea. And here it's sort of already like very, very challenging. Yeah, if knight h5, this was actually really nasty. At first, I thought that this might be a cool defense, but it turns out, because if queen takes here, you actually have rook h8. This is a common defensive idea. You attack the queen. The queen has nowhere great to move. If you take, you play king takes. They can check you, but you go king e7, and this bishop's very active. You're threatening rook f8. Your king's actually relatively safe because white doesn't have any attackers. So it's kind of a funny position. But here they have bishop d1. This move is so nasty. So the idea is that if you take the bishop, I take with check, and this knight's gonna like get pummeled. And then white has a bishop attacking you. In addition to the rook lifting, it's going to be absolutely atrocious. And you have no good move here. I'm just going to take your knight with the bishop, so I avoid. Like if rook h8 here, I just take with the bishop, and here you're dead. So this would have been really unfortunate. He plays knight h7, which is a better defense. But the problem now, here Praggnanandhaa could have played this. So the king has to go back here. Going to f8 does not help you. So it takes... f6, and then here the whole point is you can take, and this is a very easy thing to miss, e5, knight h7. Otherwise you're getting checked and taken. Notice how the queen here does not participate in defense of the second rank, very importantly. Bishop takes h7, and the whole idea is that now, like, okay, black probably should try to bring the queen in, but you play a move like knight e4, threatening to do this, and this is very bad. And if you take the bishop, then I play queen h4 check, king g8 for example, and you did. I can't believe I entered this move. Like, what am I thinking? No, you check, and the whole point is you check until the queen gets here. But notice how both of these squares are covered by the bishops, so you have to play e6. And then the idea is you're going to play rook e5 and checkmate this way. And this is just not possible to stop. Notice how all these pieces are just in a bunch and they're not doing anything. You can try sacrificing, but I take with the queen. Notice how I do not take with the king and allow this pin. I take with the queen. And if rook takes e6, I kind of check my way back, and eventually I take and I bring my rook in. And these pieces are just not useful enough. You only have a piece for the two pawns, and your king's wide open and getting mated. So... a very easy thing to miss. I think that he likely missed the sacrifice on f6. If you have to go back to f4, it's not really anything special. So I think that that's what he missed. So we ended up playing bishop e7 check, and then it's just a mess once again. And Mishra actually ended up getting the upper hand. They got to this position. So knight f3 is kind of a cool idea. Basically, they're saying that, like, if the knight lands on f5, you're gonna cry. Is essentially what he's saying, which is a very, very cool idea. But Mishra plays queen e6, which is a good defense. He doesn't even look at the bishop twice. And here, it turns out like the only way to play for white, and this kind of gives you an idea that even though these positions are dangerous for black, you get situations like this as well for white, which is really complicated. You have moves like bishop g5 check, queen h4 check. They don't help, but you know, you have all these crazy moves, right? And you have to calculate all of this, and if you get it wrong as white, which Praggnanandhaa did, and I would wager that Praggnanandhaa calculates better than 99.99% of Earth. So if he got it wrong, it's definitely quite something. But the general idea is that you know, white has to be accurate too. So that's the one thing with these kind of positions. Here, apparently, white has to play knight 65. And again, I'm showing this to you because I think figuring this out is not realistic. Even these guys did not do it. So you sacrifice, so white's down 2 pieces. But the idea is that after e5, it's really hard to move. You're threatening knight f6 check. So black plays here. The purpose of this move, incidentally, is that now if you try to take and check, I can take because the queen hangs. Very important. And here, believe it or not, white's only move is rook a d1. The idea now is if you try to do this, I don't play knight f6 check, I play this. Whoops. And all of a sudden this queen has a problem, because if you take the rook, I check, and I can always check and then grab your queen or checkmate you, very possibly. I think actually checkmate is more likely than grabbing the queen. No, I might have to grab the queen. Doesn't really matter too much. You're going to have problems because you don't even get to take on g2, right? Like if say king h8, queen h4 check here, I don't see a mate. It's kind of irritating. But I mean, even if you just take the queen, this is just over. Notice how you cannot take this because your king blocks. Very unfortunate. Yeah, there might be a mate here. It's very, I don't know. No, I don't see it. Very, very sad, right? But okay, doesn't really matter. This is clearly not good. So you actually have to play bishop here or some move like this to guard, right? Like apparently rook f8 is also possible, which I don't understand. But bishop c6 to guard here, and it's just some mess. Like white plays e6, and the attack keeps going. But this is not something that I think is too realistic to find. In the end, white went with their original idea, but after rook g8, notice how now after knight f5 you can sack. Queen f3, king g7, knight f5 check, king h8. Mishra escaped with a winning position, and he was able to win up a piece against incredibly strong player. So it was kind of a fascinating duel. There were lots of crazy lines. I was kind of showing a lot of them to you because I think for almost anyone, probably myself included, most likely, like finding these lines is just not that realistic. It's more to show you the complexity of these positions. So the main themes I would say that you can take away, though, are number one, if you are not castled yet, h6, g5 is just safe. So bishop g5 before black castles is not usually that dangerous. And you want to get it in when white is unable to sack. Once they're able to sacrifice, once you have a position like this, having stability of pieces is good. So having the knight and rook be loose is not great. Having white's rook be able to come in really fast, also not wonderful. f7 being loose, this bishop. So notice how Mishra developed a little bit, forced the bishop back, but once he felt he didn't have useful moves. If you just play like non-useful moves for any period of time, it's going to make your position worse. One trick that sometimes works is you can play like king h8 and rook g8 even in g5. That's one thing, but it takes a long time. I would say in most positions, especially with the center being highly flammable, I would call it. I wouldn't recommend it. Here I think it's probably bad. So eventually you have to brave it and play g5. But you have to make sure that you get the ideas right. So number one, you have to support your knight with a move like king g7. And then number two, so once you play king g7, you have to make sure you have it right. So do you unpin your knight? Do you play a move like rook h8 or rook g8? There are plenty of positions. Rook g8, king f8 is a great idea. Other times rook h8, and if queen g3, knight h5. Make sure queen g3 is covered. Make sure rook lifts are covered. Make sure pawn pushes are covered. And you just got to do a lot of calculating. Lots and lots of calculating. But in general, these are double-edged, interesting, rich positions, and regardless of which side you choose to play them for, I think they're very interesting and double-edged. But you have to be very, very careful for both sides about being accurate once you reach this kind of position, because one slip is usually absolutely deadly. Anyway, I thought that these positions were at least very interesting, even if you don't play as openings. I hope you enjoyed it. Once again, if you like my teaching style, if you like these videos, like, subscribe, all of this. It does encourage me to do more of them. Otherwise, If you are interested in more of my videos, you can check out my chessable courses, which are linked below. They're for like advanced beginner to intermediate kind of player. I would say they can be very useful for that level of player, and they cover kind of common mistakes people make. So, thank you, and I will see you next time.